Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about both sides of the bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at the Fortune SOC. Today's show is titled "The Formerly Incarcerated Are Good Neighbors." Safe and affordable housing is an essential component of successful reentry from incarceration. Barriers to stable, quality housing mean that formerly incarcerated individuals are less likely to find and maintain employment, maintain sobriety, complete parole supervision, and achieve the necessary stability to stay safely in the community. But despite the obvious need for housing, the 5 million formerly incarcerated people living in the United States are almost 10 times more likely to be homeless than the general public. Unfortunately, for those with legal system involvement, the use of background screening by landlords during the tenant screening process creates an additional barrier to housing. Some courts have evaluated evidence intended to demonstrate an empirical link between legal system involvement and the propensity for tenant dangerousness. Such courts have found that there is, in fact, no such link, and that community safety actually improves when there is greater access to safe and stable housing. This episode focuses on understanding how eradicating housing discrimination against the formerly incarcerated and how opening up access to safe and stable homes would improve community safety. And so our guests today are Tabor Benedict, who serves as a housing advocate at the Fortune Society. Also joining us is Flores A. Forbes. He's an associate VP for Community Affairs at Columbia University's Office of Government and Community Affairs. And then we have Murph Edmond, who is the executive director of Columbia Legal Services in Seattle, Washington. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today on both sides of the bars to talk about this very, very important issue. And so I'll jump right into it for the sake of time, and this is directed toward Tabor. Please explain your work at the Fortune Society and why you, a person with legal system involvement, don't think you're building a community is more dangerous based on you living there.
Absolutely. Andre, first of all, thank you very much for having me on. I'm very grateful to be here, especially with such esteemed panelists. And just want to thank you for your work in this area as well. I work as a housing advocate at the Fortune Society. My primary objective is to combat housing discrimination against people that have spent time in prison or jail or been arrested or had other types of legal system involvement. I also focus on advocating for legislative change, for example, here in New York, the Fair Chance for Housing Act, which we're hoping to get passed this year. And in terms of why I don't think my building or community is more dangerous because I live here, it's a very personal question, but I really appreciate it because I think it's something that really needs to be talked about with people who have spent time in prison or jail, like myself. I don't think it's more dangerous because I think I'm just so grateful to have a roof over my head, a safe place to live, and a home that I don't take it for granted. I try to be a good neighbor. I try to help people where I can. I'm actually friendly with my neighbors. I've lived here now for over 5 years on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I'm just so grateful to be here that I think that's why I don't pose a danger. And in fact, I think I'm a good neighbor. I see myself as a good neighbor. The other thing is that I've seen in various research that I've done that someone having spent time in prison or jail is not predictive of them being a successful tenant in the community. So I also know that the research bears out my personal experience. So thank you.
No, absolutely. And, I want to turn this over to Murph. And, Murphy, you're out of Seattle, and thinking about the work that Seattle has been doing in establishing fair chance for housing for people with conviction histories there. And as it happens, there are protections in place for people with conviction histories against those who seek to discriminate against them in accessing housing. But Murph, please tell us about your role at Columbia Legal Services, and based on Seattle's own Fair Chance Act, what could you tell landlords who worry they could be liable if a tenant with a criminal history causes harm to other tenants or property?
Thank you. That's a great question, and I'm really grateful. Thanks for asking me to be on the show. I'm the executive director at Columbia Legal Services. We're a statewide organization. We focus on the criminal legal system, ending mass incarceration, and rights for people who are undocumented. So we try to focus our work on where racial justice is the least in our state and in our country. And so my role, originally, I was a staff attorney at Columbia Legal Services for about 8 or 9 years before I became the executive director. And we work directly with the statewide tenants union and local community organizations. And one of the issues that kept coming up was people could not get housing. And we started really listening to what was happening. And folks with criminal records could not get in. There were blanket bans where no one with a felony, or even no one with a misdemeanor, to get into housing. And tenants asked us, is it really true? These landlords keep saying that I'm a danger. I don't feel like a danger. I'm raising my kids. I have a job. I volunteer with my kids' baseball team. Why is that? And then the landlords keep saying, well, we'll get sued. We'll get sued. It'll be horrible. We'll all get sued. Well, Seattle passed one of the broadest ordinances in the country that landlords could not look back at tenants' criminal history. And that was about 5 years ago. And the roof has not fallen in on landlords in Seattle. There has not been a mass number of lawsuits against landlords. None of that has happened. So that's what I would say to landlords, is even with the most progressive ordinance in the country that has been in effect for 5 years, those fears have not come true. What we look at when we look at whether or not a landlord can be held liable, or anyone can be held liable, is foreseeability. And Tabor talked about it. Is it foreseeable that someone with a criminal record would be more dangerous than someone without? Because landlords don't ask the question, have you ever committed a crime? That's not the question they ask. Right. They ask, have you ever been convicted of a crime? And that's where race comes in. That's the real issue here for me. But generally, is it foreseeable? And the answer is generally no. It's not more foreseeable that someone with a criminal record would again commit a crime. There's lots of other factors that landlords would need to look at. Do they have adequate locks? Do they have security systems? What is their property like? All of those kinds of things landlords can look at. And they can talk to past landlords. They can take other precautions. But this is not a way to keep people safe. In fact, as you've already talked about, not having people housed makes our communities less safe in some ways. People are more stable if they're able to access housing.
Yeah, thank you for that, Murphy. We're going to talk a little bit more about the racial piece to it, because when you think about things like disparate impact on people, particularly Black people and people of color, as it relates to being discriminated against in housing, it's a real significant issue. And so what I want to do now is I want to turn to Flores, right? And Flores, excuse me, you've been doing this work for some time, and is discrimination against legal system involvement really a problem? Shouldn't it be up to individual landlord who they rent their property to? And why couldn't someone who was turned away by one landlord just find another place to live?
Well, I think the discrimination with regards to people who are formerly incarcerated, goes way beyond the terms of living, terms of policy. The 1934 Housing Act, one of the first federal housing acts in this country, was based on race and discriminated against people of color. I'm formerly incarcerated. I have a mortgage. I've been renting in New York City for over 30 years. And, is that proof that formerly incarcerated people will not commit a crime? Well, what was basically looked at was my credit report. What does my credit say? So I think that if a landlord goes above and beyond and wants to do a background check, I think that's basically problematic. I mean, the checks that should be taking place is, can this person pay the rent? So I think that those are some of the things that are a lot more important. So like I said, federal policy has affected how people look at this. At one time, there was a program called Weed and Seed, and this was to weed out people who lived in public housing who had a criminal background. So I think it's really a little more complex than just an individual landlord wanting to take this desire. I think it's something that's in the ether, in the political ether, with regards to discriminating against people who are formerly incarcerated, and moreover, there's research that's been done that's shown that, I know you had mentioned that there are like 5 million formerly incarcerated people in the United States, but I think there are 20 to 30, 40, 50 million people who are justice involved in this country. And there's research that shows that because people who are formerly incarcerated or justice involved are being discriminated against, they're impacting the gross domestic product of this country by a negative number of like $90 billion. So it's
and why is that, Flores? Right? You say it's $90 billion. And why is that? Because they can't, obviously those individuals aren't able to contribute towards the labor pool, right? Because they don't have sustainable housing. Why is that? Just for
I mean, it's all of those particular reasons, right? You can't participate in the economy. A lot of it goes back to the I guess the foundation of the carceral state in this country, and that's the exception clause of the 13th Amendment.
Yes,
it basically makes it okay for you to be treated like a slave in prison. So therefore, when your rights are taken away from you, like voting, I mean, it's appalling that the only time someone is asked to declare something on a job application is that are they formerly incarcerated? Have they been convicted of a crime? No one asks you if you can't read. No one asks you if you can't really do the work. So I think that these are issues that I think really need to be focused on, and the root cause of many of it is because the U.S. Constitution basically says in the 13th Amendment, if you've been convicted of a crime, not only will you be treated as a slave in prison, but you can be discriminated against when you are released.
Yeah, and that's a really good point you raised. And I want to turn this right and going back maybe to you, Taber. What are the racial components of this problem, and what has been your experience with the racial components, if not directly in your work role?
Yeah, that's a great question. The bottom line is that Black and brown people are disproportionately represented in the justice system, or as I call it, the injustice system. And so when you do these checks where you're screening people out based on past legal system involvement and criminal records, it's going to have a disparate impact. It's so easily inferable that you can infer racial intent and racial discrimination. And the bottom line is that I've heard recordings that were done by testers. I've heard firsthand accounts of, and I've actually spoken directly with brokers who have had landlords and housing providers say, we only want white people. We don't want any homosexuals. We don't, and these kind of disgusting stereotypes and discrimination is prevalent. When you look at the impact of this kind of discrimination against people with legal system involvement, it perpetuates segregation. New York City is one of the most highly segregated by neighborhood cities in the country. I live on the Upper West Side. There's very few Black or brown people here. It's just really so prevalent in this city, a city that's considered very progressive, by the way, that it's something that really opened my eyes up doing this work, working with dozens of people, mostly Black and brown people, and then hearing about accounts even today of directly race-based discrimination. So it all plays together. A lot of what Flora said earlier, I have a deep understanding of through my work as well. And it's just one of those things that continues to perpetuate poverty in certain communities that don't have enough investments. And it's just a cycle. So it's definitely one of the main components of this type of discrimination is the racial components.
Sure. And I want to turn this to Murph, right? And from your vantage point, similarly, right? Like, what are the racial components of the problem, and what's been your experience either directly or in your work role?
I think the racial components have been said. In our country, slavery is legal, and we have a huge racial discrimination problem in employment and in housing and in many, many aspects of life. And we like to think that we make neutral decisions, but we don't. We have conscious bias, we have unconscious bias, and we make decisions about who we rent to and who we want to live next to us and all other kinds of decision. There is an automatic race-based decision making that happens in our minds. And I have experienced it both personally and professionally. For myself, in my late teens and early 20s, I made some significant mistakes, having a drug and alcohol substance abuse problem. I was selling marijuana, I was committing crimes, vandalism, and some other serious crimes where I could have gone to prison. Instead, I am white. I ended up in the mental health and substance rehabilitation system. And nobody has ever asked me if I've ever committed a crime. And I am just as much a criminal as someone who has spent 10 years in prison doing the same thing. And the only difference is the color of my skin. And for me, that's what this country is about in some ways. I have been given this free pass, not based on my conduct. I made terrible choices, but based on the color of my skin. And we like to think that that is no longer true. And it's very true. Our justice system is not neutral. Our justice system has been set up as a perpetuation of slavery to exploit the labor of people who are Black and people who are brown, particularly men. And that continues, that economic depression, that inaccessibility of opportunity. And I really think that to change it, we have to go to the very fundamentals of our Constitution. And we have to change how we categorize people. We have to move from a system of punishment to a system of accountability, from a system of punishment to one of healing. Because the punishment system is not working. It's based on a series of lies. It says that our justice system is based on the rule of law. And that is not necessarily true in our criminal legal system.
Yeah. And Flores, turning to you, any other thoughts that you have around this same question, right? Around, the racial components of the problem, which you kind of shared out a little bit earlier on, and how, what's been your experience with this either directly or in your role of work?
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things, let me just say this first. White supremacy is the most powerful ideology in the world. Okay, I'll say that again. White supremacy is the most powerful ideology in the world. Now, when we talk about housing discrimination and having a racial basis, it's under the rubric of urban planning. Well, urban planning in this country evolved under Jim Crow, right? And urban planning never had its Brown versus Board of Education where there was some enlightenment. It's like, all of a sudden we're going to change, right? So I think what happens in American society, and which has been pointed out by my other two colleagues, is that to use race as a basis to make decisions, there's this dishonest narrative that's going around, right? I'm a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, and I teach critical race theory. And one of the foundations of critical race theory is to dispel this act that the law or the rule of law is neutral, is colorblind, and is objective and balanced. Now, we know that it's not, okay? But this is the premise that they use. They basically are trying to nullify any aspects of race being a significant variable within the law. And this goes all the way back to Plessy versus Ferguson, where they'll try to compare, Black people against Chinese people and saying that their behaviors and their treatments are the same. And that we see this as a neutral aspect of the law. But in American society, and especially within, housing, economic development, and other opportunities in terms of land use, I believe it's something that permeates the society, is going to continue because the changes haven't happened. I mean, there's a permanence of racism in this society, right? Now, when someone talks about, unconscious bias, unfortunately, I don't believe there's unconscious bias. I don't believe a policeman is going to whoop my ass and then all of a sudden he has to go take a test for them to understand that he whooped my ass because I was Black. Okay, I mean, let's be fair and balanced about that, right? So if someone discriminates against me in a housing issue or in some other financial issue with regards to a mortgage, I had my mortgage was being refinanced, and I had the appraiser came over, who was a white man, and he almost appraised my apartment just $100,000 above the cost. Okay, and he was using comps that were in Long Island. I live in I live in Harlem, and so I'm like, oh, okay. So I bring in another appraiser because I'm also an urban planner. I'm a real estate professional, and I know what appraisals, how you do appraisals. So I asked this other person to come in. He did the appraisal, and he's like, wow, I don't know what was wrong with this other guy. Why would he do that, right? So, that's a manifestation of the new, kind of new redlining that exists in this society, So I think that, it's really complex, but it's also simple. But like I said, we live in a society where, like I said, white supremacy is this powerful ideology. It's more powerful than any religion in this country, more powerful than any religion anywhere. It's the basis for actions of people all over the world. The only problem is people don't admit that that's why they're doing something.
Yeah, and thank you for that too. And Flores, there was, I believe, in the New York Times, there was an article featured where Dr. Khalil
Muhammad,
Muhammad, his colleague, had his home appraised by someone. And this person is an academic, a scholar even, and he and his wife, you're familiar with the story.
Yeah.
So it's an issue where, again, this kind of race-based discrimination where a person came into their home to appraise it and appraise it at a significantly lower amount than what it was, clearly on the basis of the person's race. And this person is an academic, a scholar, and everything, but it had that experiences and now leveled in a lawsuit. And so in closing, right, just Taber and obviously Murph, just some closing thoughts as we have a couple of minutes left, and we will have you all back because this is a really important topic and certainly something that we want to make sure the viewers are aware of. So I'll start off with you, Murph, and then we'll close with Taber.
Yeah, I think for us and in our work, we had to realize that we were complicit in the laws, that the way that they were written as lawyers and in the justice system, and that the justice system was working the way it was supposed to work, which was to lock up people who were Black and brown and people who were poor. But mainly it was a race-based system. And I think once we realized that, we had a lot of work to do in ourselves to not just write laws that we thought were the right, but to really work with the people who were most impacted and try to change the structure. Because in our country, we try to have this idea of individual responsibility. But that's not what the problem is. The problem is racism. And so the problem is that there are these structures in place that no matter how hard you work or how hard you try, you can't change that system. You can't get around it. It continues and it continues and it continues and it feeds off itself. What's more, what we found is it evolves. If we shut down a prison, then something evolves in its place. Electronic home detention.
Right.
That's another form of a plantation. And so we have to be mindful of not just breaking systems, but also building and transforming and making new systems that actually work for people and dismantling the white supremacy.
Absolutely. And when we think about, this intersectionality between race, gender, class, and even ability, we know that they really serve as vectors for, system inequalities, right? And all that is undergirded by racism when it impacts Black and brown people or people of color. So thank you for that, Murph. And Tabor, closing comments. We have about a minute left or so. But again, I want to make sure that we are coming back to this conversation around ending housing discrimination for people with criminal histories, because it's so important. Tabor?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd say, here in New York, we're actually in the middle of a campaign to push for the Fair Chance for Housing Act, which would eliminate from consideration the use of criminal background checks and even the inquiry into them, modeled after Seattle's law and some other places like Oakland and Berkeley. I just want to speak to the landlords and housing providers and let them know that when you discriminate against people that have legal system involvement, you are doing racial discrimination. This is a racial issue. And so when you're doing that, you are in effect, by inference, intentionally discriminating based on someone being Black or brown or non-white. And I want people to really think about that when they're looking at this law and thinking about supporting it. Come out and support with us as we rally forth to try to make real change here in New York.
Obviously, Flores, Tabor, Murph, it's never enough time. But I want to thank each of you for your leadership and your commitment to amplifying this most important issue. And to our guests, I thank you for giving us your thoughts, obviously to others who look at this show and view it. We want to thank you for viewing this show. And in the meantime, we want to just say on behalf of the Fortune Society that we thank you so much for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bars. If you are interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org. That's fortunesociety.org. Or you can find us on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. My name is Andre Ward, and I appreciate you all for joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.